Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you may happen to be, and whether you're watching live or archived. And welcome to another in the Nautel Transmission Talk Tuesday webinar series. This, if I'm not mistaken, is number 20 in the series, and that's a nice round number for an auspicious event. So we're celebrating 100 years of radio. Yesterday was the day that Kdka officially launched. In 1920, I've had to count back 100 years. That's a challenge on its own. My wife says I need to use my fingers, and I didn't have enough. But to talk about the anniversary of radio, we're going to divert a little from our usual really technical topic, and we're going to have a little fun and talk to some folks that have been around for some of this and some folks that have looked into the history of it. And I've got some excellent guests with me today. I've got Beth Mann, who's president and CEO of the Edge Media Group down in Cutest, Kentucky. Beth, welcome. Thanks for being here.
Thanks.
Now, I've got to ask, I'm terrible at regional pronunciations. Did I get Cadiz right, or is it Cadiz?
Cadiz.
Cadiz. See, there you go. This is why I asked this stuff.
Cadiz, Spain, and Cadiz, Kentucky.
Cadiz, Kentucky. Beautiful. And working from almost the other end of the country, we've got the owner and general manager of KLQP-FM County Radio, Maynard Meyer. Maynard, welcome.
Hi, great to be here.
And last and certainly not least, we've got one of the premier historians of our industry, Mr. John Snyder. A lot of you may remember John. He's been with BE, with Expiry. He was one of our agents at our Specialties Group. You, John, actually a little piece of history there. You were my chaperone for my first field trip to Alaska.
That's correct. I remember it well. And also, you and I went together up to Nome to install an ND10, I think it was, at KNOM.
That was an ND25, and that's correct. And
ND25,
that was
you're right. It was
early to mid. I've still got the pictures from that one.
Yeah.
So before we get rolling, the usual housekeeping things, and of course you'll see my head bobbing all over as I ignore the camera and pay attention to the computer, which is why I work in radio and not television. Beth, speaking of that, before we get started, you started in television, correct?
I did. I spent 10 years in television. I was involved in putting one of the first low-power TV stations on in Kentucky and in the country, as a matter of fact. And I very quickly got too old for television. It didn't take long for me to know that radio is where I needed to be. But I spent 10 years there. It was great.
Well, and radio's, where can you have this much fun? Maynard mentioned yesterday that when you've got something this much fun, it's not like we actually work for a living anyway.
That's right.
So we'll do our normal interactive. If you've got something to say, raise your hand and I'll open your mic. Or if you've got a question or comment, feel free to type it in. We've got one or two in here already from our own Jeff Wilson, who likes to throw in his snide remarks. Anybody who's used to the normal comment or the contest that we run where Mr. Disembodied Voice, Ed Sylvester, who I did not mention because he didn't show up on the cover page, but we've been doing the little contest where we put up a picture for Ed. The only requirement is it's not Ed's photo. And whoever guesses who it is first will win a swag kit. So keep an eye out, because in order to keep it so that it didn't matter when you logged in, it's buried somewhere in the slideshow. You'll see it. All right. On that note, if you are an SBE member, this does qualify for a recertification credit under Category I of the SBE recertification schedule, half a credit, sorry. So by all means, if you're filling in the form on the new SBE website, then absolutely keep track of that. Same agenda as we've had for the last 19, 20 counting today episodes. We'll talk a bit amongst ourselves. We're going to do something a little unique today, and I think it's going to be a lot of fun. One of the things that Edge Media does that over at WKDZ and in Cadiz, got it right that time, I hope, or close. They have a radio museum, and we're going to do a virtual tour of that too. So that's going to be kind of fun. And that is on our list of things to discuss. And before we get into that, Beth, tell me a little bit. I read online. I know what I read about DJ Everett III was kind of your mentor in this industry.
He absolutely was my mentor and eventually became more like a father to me. But I started working with him when I was just 17 years old. I was a freshman in college at University of Kentucky and wanted to be in the broadcast business. It's all I ever wanted to do from the time I was 7 years old. They were building a radio station across the street from me, and came home one day and I told my mom, I said, when I grow up, I'm going to own radio stations. My mom's my greatest cheerleader. She said, sure, honey, I'm sure you will. And lo and behold, that's all I ever worked toward. And so as a student in Lexington at UK, there were many students who could work for free. I was not one of those. I was trying to help put myself through school. So I drove back and forth from Lexington to Hopkinsville, which is about 225 miles each way. And I worked every weekend during college for DJ Everett, who was the general manager of the TV station there in Hopkinsville. So he and I got our start early in my career at 17. We were together my entire career. He owned stations here in Cadiz and Hopkinsville, Kentucky. And when he passed away in 2015, I became owner of the company, and also became owner of about 50 or 60 of his radios that he left for me in his will. And that was the beginning of the DJ Everett III Radio Museum.
Very cool. And you're down in that area now. So I'm going to flip over to a slide that covers that. And what I'm going to do is get everybody else and we'll all shut our cameras off. And that way, when Tom turns his camera on to do the tour, it should be the big one. And that should let us get rolling. So if you want to narrate that, we'll just take a little tour of the Radio Museum.
All right, we'll do it. We're really excited to share the DJ Everett III Radio Room with you today. Needless to say, with COVID-19, a lot of plans changed. This was the year of the bicentennial for Cadiz, Kentucky, and we kicked off the bicentennial the first week of January in the radio room pre-COVID, having no idea that the 50 events or so that we had planned for this year were actually going to be canceled, moved, postponed, may never ever happen due to COVID-19. So we've continued to add to our collection throughout the year. We now have about 300 radios here in the radio room, and this has become my refuge, my getaway. I've spent a lot of sleepless nights during COVID, just like I know you have, and I've done a lot of research and spent a lot of time trying to make the radio room an even more special room in honor of my mentor, DJ Everett III. Of course, we have to establish the history of radio, and with John Snyder on this call, I'm sure not going to embarrass myself by trying to act like I know all of the history, because we have the true historian on the line. But you'll see that we start with the history of radio, and then we move on to the history of radio in the bluegrass. And we would be remiss not to mention Nathan B. Stubblefield, because Kentucky would like to still lay claim that Nathan B. Stubblefield was the founder of radio, but those of us who have been in the business for very long know that it truly was Marconi who was the founder of broadcast as we know it today. Big kudos to Kdka, who's also mentioned in our history there on their 100th birthday last night. Of course, their very first broadcast was of live election coverage. And tonight we'll be doing live election coverage on our station for the 70th year in a row. We're excited always to provide that kind of information to our listeners on all of our radio stations. You'll see on the very first set of radios, there are amplifiers here on display. First is crystal sets. Those were sets that people would use just to experiment with radio, but actually before we actually started hearing broadcasts, we have a 1919 Commerce Radiophone crystal set. That amplifier there actually used Morse code. So it was before, the 1919 would have been before the very first broadcast happened in 1920. This was the first receiver that was for amateurs or that was not for amateurs or military communication. It was actually for commercial use. Of course, Pittsburgh produced the first broadcast on their election coverage in 1920. So you'll see the Magnavox 1920-21 right next to it with the horn. And that would have been the type amplifier that would have been used in that very first night of election coverage in 1920 on November 2nd. And it certainly would have been the unit that would have been used in the 1924 election. In 1922, we had a Victrola there. I put that there, that belonged to DJ and Beth Everett, because that was sort of the death of the Victrola. Radio probably is what actually killed the Victrola, because it became a really major entertainment value for listeners all across the world. Now, if you'll think about what was going on during this time, you know, our country was going through a whole lot. But right before radio was invented, 675,000 people were lost to the Spanish flu, and that was in 1918. And then all during the 20s, you would have heard about diphtheria in those first 3 or 4 or 5 years that claimed the lives of thousands of people. So radio has been through many tragedies, but has always found a way to reinvent itself and to survive it. Radio was booming in the 20s. There were manufacturers coming out of the woodwork, and some companies hit the jackpot and others did not do so well. Others failed, but it was the greatest, latest, newest technology in the 20s. Tom, if you'll stop right there on that breadboard, I want to talk a little bit about Atwater Kent. Atwater Kent was the largest radio manufacturer by 1925. He was a man of wealth, so he was able to invest a whole lot of money in the newest technology. And he actually is the man who has the patent for the automobile ignition coil. Knowing that will help you to see that he used a lot of automotive type parts in his radios, and you'll see those coils there on the top of that breadboard. Now, as you can imagine, women really didn't like the looks of that radio, and not many of those radios survived because they didn't have covers. That's the way the radio was actually sold as a breadboard. A lot of people bought kits from Atwater Kent, made their own. They would take a breadboard out of the kitchen, make their own radio from that, and there was a scramble for people to have receivers of their own. Throughout the 20s, you will see a lot of different manufacturers making their way into the industry. You will see Magnavox, you'll see Crosley, you'll see Fried Eisman, RCA became huge during that time, AC Dayton, Majestic Grisby Grinnell, Thompson, Apex, Dayfan, many others joined in the fun of the 1920s. Several did not make it, however, and we've got a couple of those radios that we were never able to identify because they weren't in business long enough to really establish themselves as a solid manufacturer of radios. Of course, we all know what happened in 1929. We had, of course, the stock market crash, and the greatest depression of all time happened. But I loved what happened to the radio industry at that time. You would have thought maybe that the industry, that would have been the killer of the radio industry. And in fact, it's probably what sparked it. The 30s are known as the greatest decade of all time for radio. So I'm going to concentrate, Tom, just a little bit on the 30s here. Look what happened. We moved from a lot of metal. We moved from a lot of huge tubes, exposed tubes, automotive parts. And the women got their way, and we started building beautiful radios for people to have in their homes. Rather than something that was just a mechanical tool, it became a focal point of the homes all across the country. In 1930, though, when you think about where our country was in the Great Depression, notice the names of the radios. They were called baby coffins, tombstones, cathedrals. I mean, I just think that's an interesting thing to note, that that was the mindset of people in the early 30s. I love the adjustment we made, though. We started making smaller radios. They were less expensive radios because there wasn't as much money out there. And once it became less expensive, many more developers jumped in on making them because it didn't take as much money to be a manufacturer of radios. Even with the Great Depression in full swing, radio was booming. If you'll take a look there, Tom, we've got like a Sentinel battery radio that's called a farm radio, where it used large batteries that were stored in people's homes, and the battery would be connected sometimes outdoors or under the floor in a basement area. And they did that so that people in the rural areas who didn't have electricity yet would have access to radio. If you'll look at some of the Zeniths there in that group, about a third of my collection are Zenith radios. I didn't mean for that to happen. I didn't even realize it happened until I just started counting it one day. But I love so many things about Zenith. They were always on the cutting edge, all the way to the bitter end of selling out. They were on the cutting edge. And I like when people zag. In our company, we teasingly say, everybody else zigs, we zag. We seem to do what other people don't do. And I kind of feel like Zenith was that company in the late 20s and early 30s. Zenith had unbelievable design. They made the Pancake, which is this brown radio right here in the front. They were one of the first to start naming their radios, and they They had special dials. You'll see that looks just like a pancake stack. Zenith had the teardrop there. That was a special dial. They did the black dial. They were the first to focus on what the dial looked like. It wasn't just mechanical. It was something that they used as a marketing tool. Over time, Zenith was known for tuning eyes and the super heterodyne. They hired cabinet makers with awesome designs. They had the transoceanic, which is 8 bands and all transistor. They did that so that people at sea would be able to listen to radio. They made the most successful transistor ever, the Zenith Royal 500. That was in 1955. It was less expensive to operate. They were always on the cutting edge. So you'll see all through the 30s there, a lot of consoles where people would gather around and listen to the radio and celebrate as a family what they were hearing, and then also being able to keep up economically with what was going on during the Great Depression. The Great Depression would go on to last for 10 years. I cannot even imagine. I thought our recession that happened a decade ago or so would never end. And here, you know, when you look back on it, 10 years of a major recession in our country in the 30s. But look at these beautiful radios that were established at that time. You know, Stuart Warner in 1939 up at the top, that's called a magic keyboard. They started doing things really interesting with the presets selection, but consoles were starting to become a thing of the past, and they started building a lot more radios right before the war that would be more for a mantle or a bedside table. Of course, you know, FDR would do his fireside chats, you know, during the 30s, and people would gather around to hear all about the New Deal programs. And even with all of that going on in the country, that was deemed radio's golden days of the 30s. In our pre-war collection, right before World War II began, you will start to see less wood, and you'll start to see more plastics. You'll see more bakelite radios. That became a very popular thing right as we're going into the war. And then, of course, you know, we come straight out of the 30s and the deep, dark depression, and World War II breaks out. What else could possibly happen? When we started our collection, we felt like we would have a big hole in our collection during this war section, and because the radio manufacturers were not allowed to make radios. So we bought a lot of ads there. You'll see on the walls different ads that talk about buying war bonds and why it was important to support our war efforts. And we're right at Fort Campbell, home of the 101st Airborne Division. It's in our listening area. So we had to have a good section for our war efforts. So we started building that out with ads explaining why we had no radios, but we lucked up and ended up finding a 1943 morale set that was made by Commerce, and it is over there in the trunk there for the 1944-45 section. And that morale set was made for soldiers. And it's my understanding that the cost of that set, first you had to be a soldier to have it, to buy it, but the cost of that set was a month's salary of a soldier, which just totally blows my mind that it was that important to soldiers to have the news and information around the world and to have the entertainment to spend a month's salary on a radio, but it indeed happened. The only year we don't have a radio for is 1944. So I'm gonna put my ad out there now. If you ever find a radio for 1944, please contact Beth Mann in Cadiz, Kentucky. I would love to have that. In 1945, pretty interesting little piece of trivia. You'll see here the Westinghouse refrigerator is what they called this. Well, you know, there have been promotions and campaigns and advertising going on forever. You'll see a Westinghouse ad there on the floor, actually. The refrigerator radio was not actually sold. It was given to people who bought a refrigerator. And so they didn't technically sell radios in that window of time when they weren't allowed to sell radios to consumers. They just gave one away. So your Westinghouse refrigerator radio was designed for that in mind. It was a promotion. You'll see in 1946, oh wow, I mean, our collection just takes off in abundance. 1946 was a phenomenal time for our country. Things were booming. The war was over, people were happy, money was flowing in every possible direction. And you'll see there in the post-war that we've got every color, every style, every kind of material you can think of in the collection. But one really unique one is a 1946 Bendix. That's a Catlin, the green radio there in your shot is a Bendix Catlin 526C. And it was presented to a group of distributors at a showing in New York City in late 1945. It was the first radio coming out of the military production for World War II for Bendix. And it's also the only Catlin radio that Bendix ever produced. The problem with that was it was a major design flaw. It was, guys, it's gorgeous. This video does not do it justice. But the problem with the Catlin radio was that it was a soft plastic and it has hot tubes in it. It breaks easily and it melts easily, and it did not last very long. So it was really hard to find a good collection of a Catlin, but that is a beautiful version of one that happened in 1946. On around the corner there, Tom, as you make it right towards your 1949 and 50 section, you'll see a Zenith radio that has 2 FM dials. And I find that to be very interesting. I'm sure John and Jeff can give you some more information about that. But there was a war over which FM dial was going to actually be used. And that was a long battle. FM was supposed to be much better and was going to make the listening experience better for the world to hear. And not everyone was in agreement on that. So Zenith was very wise, and in a few of their units, they put both FM dials in. So that radio there on the top, right underneath the Zenith sign you see, is an FM radio with 2 FM dials. Going on around the corner, getting into the 50s and 60s, I'll move pretty quickly on this section because we have lots to talk about today. You start to see a lot of plastics. You start to see a lot more color. Television came along, and supposedly that would be the death of radio. And as we all know, it actually probably strengthened the radio industry, but you'll see handles on almost every radio. People started carrying radios with them. In my view, that was the first boom box. It was actually about 30 years later before we really did something called boom box, but we started carrying radios with us. Our transistors were invented in 1947, and that made it a whole lot easier, a lot cheaper to run, and a lot more lightweight to carry. And then, of course, our first major mass-produced transistor radio was the Regency TR1. In 57, the transoceanic I told you about that Zenith did was designed. That was a major, major deal for the whole world in the radio listening arena, and was a big deal certainly for Zenith. There have been many pandemics. There have been wars. There's been an insurmountable number of tragedies. The assassination of John F. Kennedy was heard on radio. In fact, we have some of that actual AP wire from that time frame here in our radio room. There was 9/11. I mean, so many things have happened in our country, and radio was there through all of it. And I hope that this actually helps to share the story of how radio changed over time in order to be a part of people's lives today in every possible way. I'm gonna give Tom just a second here to make his way over. I did not intend to collect on transistor radios, but after we got started and I got thinking about how long that actually is, we were in a position to build a little extra display here in the 1966 section, which is when WKDZ signed on the air. We've got about 100 transistor radios now, ranging from early 50s all the way through somewhere around about 1980. So that's a tour, the DJ of the Third Radio Room. I hope you enjoyed it, and I invite you to Kdke, Kentucky, to come see us anytime.
And that was actually, thanks very much for that, Beth. That was one of the questions that came up while you were talking. John Coulter wanted to ask if the display is open to the public.
Yeah, it's not actually, so let me back up. It's not actually a museum because the government intervened in that progress and said, you know what, if you're going to do a museum, you have to do this, this, and this. I didn't want to do all that. So it's a training room with a very beautiful display of radios. So it's open the same hours of our radio station. I meet people here on Saturdays and Sundays a lot. You know, this is my passion. This is the love of my life. And I was just lucky enough to know what I wanted to do, you know, as a young kid, and I'm living my dream. And to be able to share it with anybody, anytime, you know, I'm more than honored to do that.
And that is like we said earlier, when you have this much fun, it's hard to call it work some days. I made the comment once that I can't believe they pay me for this, and I probably shouldn't have said that out loud where it was being
There was
recorded.
your right.
Ed, I'm going to expect you to go back and edit that little section right there. John Schneider, you're still here?
Yes, sir. Yes.
All right. We can put the cameras back on now. I think I've got the screen sharing back.
All right. There we are.
And Laverne Siemens had asked the question. I don't know the answer to this, so I'll throw it out to you. He mentioned that he watched the movie The Babe the other day, Babe Ruth, I assume. It portrayed a radio broadcast of a Yankees game in 1920, and he can't imagine that's accurate based on the game they were portraying. It actually happened in 26. Do you have any comment or any knowledge on that?
Well, presuming it was during the baseball season in 1920, there was no broadcasting going on, certainly not any remote broadcasting. Kdka and Harold Arlen did the first baseball broadcast in early 1921. And so I would say that if they were showing a baseball broadcast, they certainly had the year wrong, if nothing else.
So a little bit of artistic license, but
Yes,
not
well,
unexpected.
they don't hire historians a lot of time when they do movies. But
now, speaking of historians, you do have a radio history website, theradiohistorian.org, and this is one of the photos from that. That's saying earlier, I'm a total unashamed plagiarist. I stole that directly from your website. Do you want to speak to this one?
my lawyers will be contacting you shortly.
The royalty check is in the mail.
Yes, okay. Well, that is a colorized version of the famous photograph of the Kdke election night broadcast. I think they actually sat for this photo a day or two after it took place because, as we can see outside the windows, it's still daylight. Where the election returns came in the evening in November. That wouldn't have been the case. But that is the original team that broadcast the election returns on Kdka on November 2nd, 1920. There's a 100-watt transmitter in the background that was built specifically for that occasion in the Westinghouse shop. Finished just days before the broadcast went on the air. The microphone looks a little odd. It's actually a telephone carbon microphone inside a cardboard box. So that's that square thing you see is not a specialty microphone. It's just a cardboard box. So they were improvising in order to get the station on the air at that time.
And it's one of those, you talk about the technology, and I mean, you think about those and then moving forward to these, and it's just, it's astounding.
Oh yeah. I thought I'd talk a little bit about why Kdka is significant. Radio really started around the turn of the century as a means of Morse code communication. And later, it wasn't too much later before experimenters determined that they could impress the voice upon the radio wave and transmit the human voice or audio, first done with arc or alternator transmitters, and then finally with the DeForest invention of the triode tube. It made everything much easier. But in the beginning, they saw radio had one huge disadvantage. They saw it as a communication means, and the problem with it wasn't private. A lot of early experimenters tried to figure out ways that they could make radio private so that other people couldn't listen in on the communications. But a few people discovered or figured out early on that that was not a disadvantage. It actually could be turned into an advantage with the ability to send messages from one to many. So there were a lot of early experiments in broadcasting that predate Kdka. The oldest that we know of was Doc Harold in San Jose, California, who was doing regular weekly broadcasts with a transmitter that was an arc, electrical arc suspended in a bath of alcohol, and that was in 1912. And his wife was doing a weekly DJ program, had contests on the air, would borrow records from the local record shop and promote the record shop on the air. So there was a lot of early broadcasting going on during the 1916 San Francisco International Exposition. He broadcast 8 hours a day of programming, mostly phonograph music, to a DeForest receiver that was located at the fair. So we can certainly say that that was broadcasting, but it wasn't broadcasting to what we might call a citizen audience, because citizens at that time did not have radio receivers. You could not buy a radio receiver. You had to build it yourself, and mostly the audience were amateur radio operators and experimenters. Those amateurs and experimenters became very important during World War I. A lot of them were drafted or enlisted and became radio men in Europe during the First World War. And in the process, a lot of patents were suspended during the war, allowing competing technologies to be put together and make better performing radio transmitters and receivers. All of these young men came back from the war, often with radio tubes in their suitcases, because tubes were still very hard to come by. And they came home and immediately started transmitting voice programming on their amateur radio stations. Starting in at the end of 1919, when the government again allowed amateurs to broadcast at the end of the war. So the two things that came about to create this were the war and its technological developments, particularly in the area of transmitting tubes, training these operators, and at the end of the war, allowing the public again to transmit and listen to radio. Some of the first amateurs who started radio stations were a station in Seattle that started at the end of 1919. It became today's KJR. Station in Los Angeles that became KNX, started in early 1920. In August of 1920, the Detroit News put on an amateur station that was really a broadcast operation, was promoted in the newspaper, but operating at the bottom of the amateur band. It became WWJ. So a lot of the amateur stations from that period became broadcasters. So saying Kdka was the first station is not entirely true, but Kdka is still the most significant station at that time, because we could say it's the first station that was created with a business plan, which was to sell radio receivers, and it was created to broadcast to the public and not just an amateur radio audience. So if we compare radio broadcasting to, let's say, aviation, those early experimenters are the equivalent of the Wright brothers, just figuring out how do you make this thing get up in the air. Now, Kdka in turn is the radio equivalent of the first air transport company. Let's take this technology and let's make a business out of it. Let's do something useful with it for the general public. And so that was the jump off point where radio ceased being experimental and started to be a consumer product. Westinghouse was also making radio receivers, and they saw this as going to be their entree into the radio business. Beth, you'll probably recognize this. This was made by Westinghouse in 1921. It's an Areola Junior crystal set. And this is the purpose of Kdka, was to sell products like this to the public. And there on the dial, it says Westinghouse.
Awesome.
So this is the other side of the Kdka story, and why Kdka is so significant to the creation of radio broadcasting as a business and a public medium.
Now, one note Beth had made when she was going through the radios was the receiver with the 2 FM dials on it, and FM radio, and I'm going to throw another note in there because that was around about the 1949, 1950 mark, right, Beth?
Right.
And it was right after World War II that FM switched to the current 88 to 108 band in the U.S. Is that right, John?
FM started as an experimental service in 1940, just before the war, and it was assigned 42 to 48 megahertz, which was the original TV channel 1. That's why we have no channel 1 on TVs today, because the FCC took channel 1 away and gave it to Edwin Howard Armstrong's technology and said this will be the FM band. FM was getting a good start until the war stopped everything. At the end of the war, there was a lot of intrigue to try and slow down the development of FM by the entrenched AM operation, AM operators, particularly RCA. So they had 2 issues. One was they felt that the frequency was not high enough. It would be subject to skip interference during the summer and high ionospheric conditions, which actually would have been the case, although not as bad as they made it out to be. And the second and more important issue is the band should be larger. There were only 6 megahertz of space, which the FCC decided to move to the current 88 to 108 band. So the band was increased from 6 to 20 megahertz. And if you think about it today, how would our present FM infrastructure exist in only 6 megahertz? We really needed the extra space, but that set FM back a considerable period of time. Until 1948, the stations that had originally gone on the air, the pioneer FM stations operating in the low band, were allowed to continue to operate. So they could operate, some of them had a transmitter in the low band and a transmitter in the high band. And so during that 3-year period of time, both FM bands were in operation, which is why a company like Zenith during that very short window had to make a receiver with 2 bands. Eventually, by 1948, all of the stations in the low band were told to turn off, and the upper band was the only operating band. But by that time, television was coming out, and FM was kind of a forgotten stepchild, and that really set it back, as we know, pretty much until the 1970s.
Yeah, it was 1976, I think, is the year that FM passed AM in estimated listenership. Now, and it was around about that time, Maynard, if you're still here, I'll get you to turn your camera back on. And it wasn't too long after that that you built your station. Is that about right?
That's right.
Yeah.
In 1983, we came on the air, and a lot of people were wondering why we didn't have an AM along with the FM, because everybody else around here did. But we were strictly FM, came on at 3 kilowatts, and they're 25 kilowatts today.
So you've seen some things change, and we're going to touch on that in a couple of slides too. Chris Hayes makes mention of Ken Burns's Empire of the Air, talking about the development of FM, and he thinks it's on PBS Passport, if anybody's interested in that. Now, election coverage, since Kdka was the first election coverage, there's no question that there's been a lot. What are we looking at here, John? Just give me the 100-foot view.
This is the main studio at CBS in New York City in 1940, the night that they covered the election returns for the Roosevelt and Wendell Willkie presidential contest. And this shows how radio had set up a large operation to broadcast the election returns. certainly not with the fancy sets that television required, but you can see it was quite a large operation with 3 commentators reporting, the famous Bob Trout and Elmer Davis, boards where the latest tallies were posted, and a lot of people on the telephone watching the teletypes. It was quite an elaborate operation, and this was a time when radio was still competing with newspapers for news coverage, and radio had obviously an extreme advantage in election returns because it reported up to the minute. Newspapers had to had their deadline and had to wait till the ink was dry in the paper before they could put out the return. So the newspapers were having a hard time competing with radio. The most famous case of that is the 1948 Truman-Dewey election, where the Chicago Tribune hedged their bet and published the famous Dewey defeats Truman headline, and that just kind of was the end of it. Radio was, and later, of course, television were going to take over the election reporting arena, and there was nothing that newspapers could do to compete with them.
And that makes a good point that Maynard, you'd mentioned it earlier, and I know I grew up in a small town with a weekly newspaper and a local radio station, and you made the comment that something about obituaries.
Yeah, I said we do about 5 local newscasts every day, all of which include several local obituaries. And of course, we still do lost dogs and lost cats and all of that kind of thing that people would be lacking if we weren't here. Newspaper comes out once a week. So that's the only other source of information other than scattered Facebook, which is kind of a disorganized way of getting your information. So we like to look at ourselves as the people that put it all in one place for you to find it.
Exactly. Now, speaking of election coverage, I'm going to address both of you on this one because election coverage from having 20 or 30 people in a room has changed quite a bit with the advent of social media. Beth, how do you guys handle stuff like this now? I mean, I assume you still do on-the-air coverage, but what about the media results as well? How do you work with that?
All of the above. Up until tonight's election coverage, we have large studios. We have all of our people working. We would be doing precinct by precinct coverage, selecting particular people to go into the larger precinct so that we can get quicker results. We're actually in the field reporting tonight. Of course, a little bit different because our results could be, my understanding, on the 10th of November before we actually know who has won some of the races. So tonight we're going to be virtually all from different locations reporting into one source using NewsBoss software. We'll be doing headlines and updates 3 times an hour on the hour starting at 6 o'clock tonight Central Time with various reports for each of the counties. So if it's got a county that has a local race, that will be on one station versus the state and national being on all of our stations. So yeah, we're still doing in-depth election coverage. I mean, I don't think you can claim yourself to be a true news operation and avoid election coverage. I mean, if you're going to be in the news business, be in the news business. You can't just pick and choose that.
All right. Maynard, what are your thoughts on that? I know you guys are doing a lot of election stuff too.
Well, we started about 8 o'clock tonight, and we cover all the local races around here. We don't spend too much time on we have a national network which covers on the hour for the national stuff, but we concentrate on the city councils, the county commissioners, the school board, all of that kind of thing that has become much easier. The Secretary of State in Minnesota, I'll have to give them credit for putting together an extremely good website where all the information is fed to that, and precinct by precinct, very accurate and pretty fast, but as opposed to the old days where you had to spend a lot of time on the telephone bothering people that didn't want to talk to you. And so there again, we take all that information and put it in one place for people to find it. So
very, very cool. Everybody will notice that Mr. Disembodied Voice's picture showed up on this page. I've got 4 different answers on the contest, and all 4 of them are different. So I've got Edwin Armstrong, Guglielmo Marconi, Lita Forrest, and Reginald Fessenden. Ed, unmute and tell the folks who you are today.
I thought it was Sean Penn, but apparently not. It was in fact,
last week.
it is in fact Marconi.
So Marco Aridi's the winner of the contest this week. Good call on that one, Marco. This is something I'm going to bring John back in for a moment. So this is the Kdka transmitter site. I think we'd said earlier that it's a few months after the original election night photo that we posted earlier.
Right. I looked up the details, so let me correct your slide here. That original photograph was Kdka's original 100-watt transmitter, which was on the air on the November election return coverage. But in August of 1921, the power was increased to 500 watts. And this is the second, we're actually looking at the second Kdka transmitter here. This is a 500-watt transmitter. The cabinet in the middle has 8 tubes. The cabinet on the left in front of the window is the modulator, basically a big audio amplifier. And the cabinet on the right is the power control that controls the power coming from batteries and from motor generators that were in another room. So you're only seeing the working part of the transmitter here and not the power source part. But this transmitter, as just about every transmitter of this period, used Heising modulation, and it was lucky if it could achieve 40% modulation.
There you go.
With 8 tubes, and the tubes had anywhere from a few hundred to, at best, 2,000 hours of life.
Thanks to the power of technology, updated on the fly. So Chris Hayes makes the comment that that's way before OSHA. I've been in a few AM sites that don't look a whole lot different than this, other than, you know, some of the technology's changed, but open phasers. So there's a reason we do the safety presentations. One quick question, Elaine, our publicist, wanted to know, John, who did the colorizing on the old photos? And I know the answer, but I'll let you deal with it.
I do my own colorizing. I have a collection of about 2,500 photographs of early radio broadcasting. So I scan them, I clean up the photos in Photoshop, and then I colorize them and use that to produce a calendar of historic radio broadcast photos. And each one is in color with historic information about the photograph. And if you're interested in learning more about that, you can go to my website, which is there on the slide.
Yeah, and I've got a link to the calendar later on too, so anybody wants to grab a screenshot, go ahead and do so. And you're a nonprofit for the calendar, correct?
No, I make a small little profit, and that really is what funds my collection of photographs. So it's a true retirement micro business.
A labor of love. Yeah. And speaking of the calendar, there is this year's calendar photo. And what are we looking at there? Because that is not your average Axia or Wheatstone control surface there by any stretch.
That was the master control room for NBC studios in Rockefeller Center in New York, starting in 1932. It took 4 to 6 men to operate this control panel, which did the routing of the audio signals for all the radio stations that were on the NBC network. There is a little panel for each of the separate telephone line circuits, and the operators would program in advance what would be coming up at the next half hour or quarter hour period. All of that was pre-programmed, and then during the station breaks, they would press one button and everything would change. So they didn't have to do change 25 patch panels all in 30 seconds.
That's probably a good thing, because Well, we all know the less you involve operator requirements, the less chance there is of queuing an open mic on the air when you're talking to somebody on the phone.
Right. Or feeding the output of an amplifier into the input of an amplifier that feeds the network and 60 radio stations broadcast feedback squeal.
Now,
Those kinds of things did happen.
Yep, and we're talking about history. This is a little bit of family history. I know he's in the audience. He sent me the email earlier, and John Van Milligan with Colorado Public Radio. John, this is some family for you, yeah?
Yeah, both my parents were radio engineers, so I had no choice.
You kind of evolved into it, if you will.
Yes.
Now, what's the console that your mother's sitting in front of?
I think that's an RCA. If you look behind her back, that's a lathe. She cut lots of most of the recordings were done on disc, and then her later years they finally got a tape machine.
And then your dad to the right, that transmitter, I'm going to guess, is at least 50 years old. I mean, I see the control panel in the room as well.
Yeah, that's around mid 50s, I think. So I think the transmitter was put in about that time. So I think we were brand new. If you look up whatever model that RCA, I think it's 5 kilowatts, and it's pretty big. Compare that to a new Nautel.
Well, a 5 kilowatt AM now is a 19-inch rack, including the filter and the power supply. So, yep, things have gotten a lot smaller. Of course, a 50 kilowatt's not a whole lot bigger anymore. It's kind of amazing. And I know Maynard, I told him I was going to get the one dig in, but I'm going to be nice about it, so brace yourself. Now, Maynard just bought a new FM. He didn't buy one of ours, but he did do a lot of research, and he bought what he figured fit best, so I don't begrudge that. But what you got is a 10 kilowatt that is not very large at all compared to what you replaced.
No, it's about the size of a small refrigerator. That's about it. Pretty amazing compared to the old days. I had the opportunity to work on some of those transmitters like that over the years. Quite a difference.
Yep, no question at all. Now, getting to both of you, and I'll start with Maynard first. So you've kind of given us a little cue, and I said earlier, I'm not going to ask for processor settings or anything proprietary, but what are the kind of things you do to keep things going? It's like you said, you're not getting rich, but you're having a lot of fun.
Right. Well, community involvement's a big thing for us. Our city of license is about 1,500 people. We serve 7 counties around western Minnesota, eastern South Dakota, a lot of similar sized communities. So we do a lot of local sports, try to get involved there. This year we didn't get to do a lot of the things we usually do, the county fairs and all that kind of thing due to the COVID situation, but we came up with some ideas for virtual county fairs and things like that, and managed to sell some sponsors and a variety of things like that. But one photo with the kid in the car holding the bingo card there, we did in-car bingo at one of the local parks, and a lot of cars pull up with families in it, and we just called bingo over the radio. They had the cards that we handed out, no charge to play, and gave away a bunch of prizes. Had sponsors there, so we're trying to do a lot of innovative things and just stay involved in the community every way we can. I've been on the city council for years. I was on the school board and chamber director in town, and helped reopen the local movie theater, which we still run here as well. So this total involvement for us is the key.
Excellent, thank you. And Beth, I know you guys pride yourselves on your news coverage. It's something that's mentioned on the website too. So you do what, a whole bunch of news?
News is huge for us. In fact, we do an hour of news at noon and 5 every day, news on the top of every hour on every station that we own. We feel like we've kind of taken responsibility for news coverage across our region. As newspapers have done less, we've done more. And we feel like really a lot of the pullback on print has just given us tremendous opportunity, and they've opened the door wider and wider for us, and we've just walked right through that door. We're really hyper focused on Main Street, like you, Maynard. I mean, if it moves in our community, we make sure we're the first to know about it, to talk about it, and share it with our listeners. We're very heavily involved socially. Our digital presence is huge. We average over 1 million page views a month on our websites. which is pretty impressive when you look at a town the size of Kdke. Our city of license is about 3,000 people in the city of Kdke, county of 13,000, but we do have a nice region that we serve. Digital has been huge for us. We have an all sports website. You'll see a runner there on cross country. We're 3 years into yoursportsedge.com. We cover 9 high schools, 18 sports deep, which is very aggressive coverage. I mean, we're doing 20-25 sports stories a day on yoursportsedge.com. That site has really been a huge contributor to our digital presence. We believe in radio and digital combined. We've been heavy in the digital business for 20 years, and all the way from digital signs to apps. We have a huge email marketing plan, over 25,000 email addresses that we email to every day. We combine all of that, and radio is the driving force. Radio is in the driver's seat. That's what makes all of our digital products successful, is the ability to promote it on 7 radio signals across Western Kentucky.
I'm going to throw a little bit of a curveball at you. Future plans, HD radio. Any plans to add extra signals to your signals, so to speak?
I'll go first on that. We really don't have plans for that. You know, I'm really trying to watch what's going to happen with radio over the air versus radio over the internet. I'm really watching that piece. HD receivers still are not prominent in our region. I mean, we are rural Kentucky. We're about 80 miles from Nashville. So Nashville will maybe drive that market a little bit more for us, but we feel HD, you know, until the receivers, until that piece picks up greatly, that's probably not our best use of money. Instead, we try to invest a lot more in really good apps, really good processing for all of our streams. You know, I think digital, you know, it opens up a lot of world for us to be in. We started a statewide radio network right during COVID, literally the day of COVID, March 16th, we launched a statewide radio network that has digital and radio presence. And I'm anxious to see what the growth plan for that's going to be. I'm looking forward to seeing what that's going to be post-COVID.
And I got to put in my little plug. Today's lunch is brought to you by the KBA. So.
Hey, great.
Maynard, I know you and I had some discussion on this a while back, and I know you guys run analog only, but you're sort of hedging your bets and you wanted something upgradable to just include the digital if it came to pass, so to speak. Yeah, because you're the same situation as Beth. You're not a huge HD radio presence in your market.
Yeah, we bought the transmitter is HD ready, so to speak. I don't foresee it's going to happen in the near future, but I never say never either. So, however, I am not getting any younger. So if I got to do these things, I've got to pick up the pace a little bit. Yep.
So one question, Beth. Chris Hayes asked, "What's with the picture of the cat in the laundry hamper?" I'm not sure if you know, because I just stole a collection off your Facebook page. But what's the story to that one?
So we just did a Cutest kitty contest. We do a lot of contests with our listeners. You know, we try to find a lot of entertainment value because we do so much news. We do so much live breaking. We do intense weather coverage. We kind of just tossing stuff at people. And during COVID, you know, at times you just felt like you're beating people over the head with news maybe they didn't really want to have. So we worked really hard to find some fun, entertaining things. So we just finished our Cutest kitty contest, and that is probably a picture from that.
There you go. And I got to tell you, I've got one upstairs that would probably win that contest, but well, I may be a little biased. This is true. This is true. Elaine wants to know what's the size of your news staff. I know you show at least 24 people on the web page, Beth. So how many people do you have dedicated primarily to news?
We have 7 people who work primarily news, but every person on our staff works for 2 departments in our company. Every person on our staff, 30 plus, work for the sales department and they work for the news department. We all know that we're contributing to those 2 departments every single day. We're on the lookout for both news and business opportunities. And, you know, I've been very blessed to hire people who want to grow. And as long as they want to grow, then I'm not doing my job if I don't find opportunities for them. So we're constantly looking for ways to grow our company. And I'm very bullish. I mean, I feel terrific about the position radio's in right now. I think people who have cash and are willing to take chances right now have tremendous opportunity to grow in 2021.
And Maynard, that's something I'm going to toss at you too, because I noticed on your website almost, and I say almost, if I look at your staff page, just about everybody's got multiple titles. And I mean, that's kind of a.
We have 3 full-time people, our traffic director slash receptionist, and myself. I'm the morning guy, most of the engineer, I'm the news director, and everything else. We have another, I don't do sports. We've got another guy that does sports and sales, and also some on-the-air work. So 3 of us full-time, along with the automation system, and a couple of part-timers, and it keeps us pretty busy, but we get it done.
Yep. Well, and it's like you all have said. I mean, where else can you have this much fun and you know, pay the bills at the same time? So, on that note, we have hit the top of the hour. I want to just throw up the usual webinars. This one will be archived. You can find it on the webinars link on our website or on our YouTube channel. We do a Waves newsletter. There's one, if Fiona hasn't released it yet, it will be out this week. I'm almost certain. She's probably correcting all my spelling mistakes as we speak and growling at me under her breath. This is the reason that I look for the little red squiggly lines whenever we type anything. On that note, I want to give special thanks. Beth, thank you very much for the tour of the radio room and for your time today.
My pleasure.
John, I want to thank you very much for your historical input, because I've been around for the last 30 years, but I've got very little idea what happened before then. And Maynard, for the perspective from the smaller communities, it's just been great having all 3 of you. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
Thank you. We enjoyed it.
Thanks, Jeff.
And on that note, folks, I want to thank you all very much for spending an hour of your time with us today, and we hope to see you next week. Have a great day.